Hi everyone, and welcome to our first video in the QDU Academy series this year for the Year 11 competition. Today we are talking about the first debate in this competition, which is that we should never pay cyber ransoms. So in this session I will be covering a couple of things. There will be no get to know activity just because this is an online recording, but I will be covering firstly just a bit of context for this debate. So why are we having this debate and what are the issues that surround it? The second thing I'm covering is a bit of setup. So how can we set up this debate to work in your favor, and how can we frame this debate very strategically for our side? The third thing I'm going to cover is just a bit of brainstorming, and I'll give some time to brainstorm. And then the final thing I'll cover in this session would be points of information. So how to give and receive points of information and some handy tips around that as well. So to begin with exploring this topic, it is really important to consider why we are having this debate. So on my screen at the moment, I have a video which explains what cyber ransoms are and what the issue is at the moment and why it's so prominent. The link for this video should also be in the description, so feel free to pause this video to watch this second video first. So the first thing to ask yourself whenever you are presented with any topic in a debate is to understand why we are having the debate. This is because every debate is underpinned by a problem. It is important to unpack this problem to understand what we need to prove to win the debate. So for example, as the affirmative team, you need to argue that there is a problem and that this problem is significant enough that there needs to be a change that occurs. As the negative team, you have two options. You can firstly argue that there isn't a problem, or secondly, argue that there is a problem, but this problem isn't significant enough for the affirmative team's model to be accepted, or that the change proposed by the affirmative team isn't the best change that can necessarily occur. On the screen, I have some examples of cyber ransoms that have occurred recently. Some key events recently include cyber ransoms on large companies such as Optus and Medibank, but also some cyber ransoms on small businesses such as medical practices and law firms. It would be useful for this debate to do some research around these examples, think about how they support or oppose our points, and consider the impact of cyber ransoms on a range of victims. Alright, the next thing you want to do in a debate is to think about the stakeholders. So stakeholders are basically people who are affected in a debate or are going to be involved by the topic that is set. You want to write down a list of your stakeholders, and once you've written down a list of your stakeholders, you want to think about a couple of things. You want to think of firstly, what are your stakeholders' motivations? So for example, in this topic, you might want to think about who are the types of people who commit cyber ransoms, and what do these people particularly want, whether it be money, more attention, or just to create fear. The second thing that you want to think of are who are the most important stakeholders on your team's side, and why do you think they are so important? So for example, do you particularly care about small businesses who are impacted by cyber ransoms? Or do you more so think that, or you're going to focus your debate more heavily on the people that commit cyber ransoms and whether cyber ransoms will actually stop, banning payouts will actually stop these people from committing crimes? The third thing you want to think about is what will happen to your stakeholder under your opposition side and your side. And with this one, this is where research comes really handy and useful, because you can use past examples to back up the claim that you are currently making. In terms of thinking about what will happen to your stakeholder under both sides, it is important to think about the benefits and the harms. And it is really important in the debate to really clearly list what are the benefits and the harms to the adjudicator as well. Fourth dot point, and the most important dot point, is why should we care about this stakeholder, right? This is when we start to impact our point and we start to think about, why is this stakeholder someone that's particularly important on our side? Is it maybe because they are the most, there are a lot of them. So for example, a lot of people are victims of cyber crimes, or is it because they're a minority group? There's a lot of different angles you can take to persuading the adjudicator on why you should care about a particular stakeholder. Another tip I would have for stakeholders as well, in terms of the benefits and the harms, it is good to think about the spectrum of harms and benefits that occur under your side and the opposition side. So what this means is think about the range of impacts that are likely to occur. So for example, you can think about the range of people that are affected by cyber ransoms, for example, small businesses to large corporations, or the impact of cyber ransoms from having to pay like millions of dollars to like a criminal versus not being able to access your files for a few days. Some examples of stakeholders who would potentially be affected in this debate are, firstly, victims. Think about the people or the companies affected by these attacks and what they are responsible for. And secondly, the criminals. So who are the types of people that commit cyber attacks and what is their primary motivation? Once we have determined our stakeholders and the people who are involved in this debate, we can begin to characterize them. Characterizing is the part of the speech where we are describing our stakeholders in different contexts, and the purpose of this is to make our argument a lot more plausible or relevant. This is when we are trying to basically describe who the people involved in our debate are, what they want, and therefore, because of this, how they are impacted by the debate. Why is this really important? Strong characterization is really important because it makes your world in the debate a lot more believable and persuasive. If you can persuade the adjudicator that your particular stakeholder will act in a particular way because of something else, this means that the world that you portray under your side will seem a lot more believable to that adjudicator. So another thing to note as well is that characterization can be used very strategically. If you are able to prove to the adjudicator that your characterization is true and that they should care about this, or you are able to prove why your characterization is more realistic than the opposition's, you can win a debate. So this is something that can be used very strategically to help you win debates. So what are some things that you can characterize? Firstly, if we are planning on banning something, we can characterize what the issue is. So if we are banning something as the affirmative team, it would be useful to tell me how incredibly harmful the thing you are banning is and why it is so incredibly harmful. So for example, you can use the people that are affected in like the issue if you don't ban something. Another thing you can characterize would be if you were like an affirmative team again or a negative team and you were giving a group of people some more power. It would be good to characterize those people that you are giving more powerful as like good. And this is through describing like their intentions and therefore like the outcomes that would occur under your side. So for example, in a topic that we should lower the voting age to 16, we are giving more power to young people. So it will be more strategic for the affirmative team to characterize these young people as really good people who can take control of their own decisions and are also responsible enough to vote. Some general tips in terms of characterizations. Firstly, be really specific. So the more specific you are, the better, and that's when you can use examples as well to back up your claims. The second thing in terms of general tips is just to always link your characterization to how it has impacted the debate. So for example, if you have told me that for example, people who commit cyber ransoms people who commit cyber ransoms do so because they want money. What does that necessarily mean for the debate? What does that mean if we implement the affirmative teams model or we don't implement the affirmative teams model then? The final slide I'm going to go through is just a little bit of information on impacting. So impacting is basically the part at the end of every single point or at the end of every single piece of rebuttal where we tell the adjudicator why they should care, or we also tell the adjudicator what our point or piece of rebuttal means for the debate. So where things have gotten us and what we have proved. For example, in a topic that we should ban smoking, an example of an impact for a point such as smoking is bad for your health would be, under the opposition's world, where smoking is not banned, the prevalence of diseases such as lung cancer and heart disease will likely be higher. Therefore, this will impact not only those who smoke, but the livelihoods of their immediate families, as poor health can detrimentally impact education, employment, and income. So see in this point, for example, we go beyond just explaining what the current issue is and, for example, how our model or the opposition's model doesn't necessarily benefit or does benefit our particular stakeholder or point. Rather, we take it a step further and we kind of quantify or qualify the impact of our point. So for example, Firstly, if we are implementing something, when you are impacting, we can mention the number of people affected. So for example, like by implementing a new legislation, are there going to be lots of people that are going to be impacted by this, and is this necessarily a good thing? The second way we can impact is when we are describing a harm. So when we are describing a harm, we can mention the intensity of that harm and we can describe that intensity. The third way we can impact is during rebuttal. So once we have rebutted someone's point and we've kind of disproved it, it is always important to have one final sentence to link it back to your case. So what does this necessarily mean for your team's side and your team's case now that you have disproved that the opposition's point? The final thing is, in terms of impacting, that it would be good to be very comparative. What does your world look like and what does the opposition's world look like now that you've given me a lot of information on the stakeholders and their characterization? The final thing that I'm going to go through in terms of setup for this recording is the model. So because this is a should or policy debate, we need a model. The negative team doesn't necessarily need a counter model, but the negative team could have a counter model if they wanted to. Note that if the negative team decided to have a counter model, for example, the negative team would also have to prove why this would better solve the problem than the affirmative team's model. So that's just something to keep in mind for the negative team as well, if they were to choose to have a counter model. So what a model does is that tells the adjudicator how your policy is going to be implemented. Some tips in terms of creating a model. Firstly, do some research on the status quo. Think about what is currently implemented and what is currently occurring. A really common mistake that past students have made is when their model is exactly the same as the status quo. That just makes it a lot easier for the opposition to call you out. You want to explain to the adjudicator how your model goes beyond the status quo and therefore improves the status quo. The second tip for a model is to not go into much detail. So for example, we don't necessarily need a timeline of when things are going to be achieved, what sector of the government is going to be implementing what, and who is going to be regulating certain things. Rather, it is more important for an adjudicator that you focus on the bigger picture and think about what is your model overall trying to achieve and the overarching goal of a model. The final tip, and one of the most important tips for a model as well, is to think about the flaws that might occur under your model. So how can we modify our model to get around this? So for example, for this topic, as the affirmative team, although the affirmative team might, for example, have a model that is like, as the government, we would not pay any more cyber ransoms and we would discourage companies from doing so. Something that the affirmative team could consider is how will not paying cyber ransoms actually stop cyber ransoms. So it's important to think about the little flaws and like the loopholes in your model itself. A final point as well is to never fully rely on your model or a counter model as a form of rebuttal. And this is also another mistake that a lot of past students have made. So it is important to think to yourself, even if my model goes wrong or doesn't work as effectively as it could, why is my side still significantly better than like the status quo, for example? And it is also important to not always bring your model into every piece of rebuttal and, for example, say the opposition's point or the opposition scenario will not occur because our model will prevent that from occurring. It is more important to really rebut the opposition's model directly. Okay, in a real life recording, we would do a couple of brainstorming. We would have a couple of minutes for brainstorming. So feel free to pause this video now if you would like to brainstorm, but for now we'll move on. So the final thing I wanted to cover in this recording would be points of information. So in year 11 and year 12, the QDU has introduced points of information. And they're really interesting. So points of information are basically questions we can ask the opposing speaker during their speech between 1 and 7 minutes of their speech. So the way we ask point of information is that we will stand up and we will say point of information. And the opposition speaker can either accept by saying yes or wave them down by saying no. So what's the purpose of a point of information? There are a couple of things that points of information are useful for. Firstly, points of information can clarify something the opposition said. This is particularly good if you aren't very clear on what the opposition is saying or you find that they go on a bit of a tangent. The second thing points of information are good for is when you want to challenge the opposition. So for example, this would be useful if you wanted to bring up an example they used or something they mentioned. or like you can, the third way that points of information are very useful is when you is to interrupt. So for example, we can interrupt the opposition's points with facts or something about our case and ask them to respond to our case. This is really useful if we find that the opposition hasn't really responded to an example or point in our case and we really wanted them to engage with that example. So this is when this type of point of information would become useful. The final point of information would be a principal extension. This is a more difficult one, but it is also a particularly strong one. So principles or extensions are basically where we give a scenario and we ask whether the opposition would agree with it or not. So for example, if the topic was that we should ban smoking, as a negative team, we could ask the affirmative team, if we would ban smoking, would you also ban drinking? If the affirmative team says yes, you can mention in your own speech about how extreme they are. If they say no, you can mention about how their team is a bit inconsistent. It is really important to make sure your points of information are a maximum of 2 sentences, that they're really easy to understand, and they're also super relevant to the topic. And really make sure that they are in the form of a question as well. On the slide right now, I just have a couple of example sentences of how we can structure a point of information. Another thing to note is that on this slide, I've also attached a really useful video created by the QDU on how to offer points of information and also how to accept them as well. So the link for this one should be in the description of the video as well. If not, it is also on the QDU YouTube channel. Just a final slide on points of information as well. So your team needs to ask 6 points of information for each speaker on the opposing team. Even though the opposing team speaker can only accept 2 points of information, it is still important that you ask in total 6. So the way you break it down is you usually ask 2 points of information per speaker in your team to the opposing team. As a speaker itself, when you are speaking, it is important that you also only accept 2 POIs, no more, no less. Just some overall sheets. Firstly, have a POI sheet. Before a debate, you should try to have at least 6 points of information written down on that. And a POI sheet is particularly useful to share POIs around your bench and around your team members. Second tip is to write down your POI fully before speaking it out loud. And the final tip is to make sure you don't accept POIs during your rebuttal, rather accept them at the end of your point or before beginning one. So this just prevents you from losing your train of thought if you were like in the middle of your rebuttal or a middle of a point, for example. Just some helpful hints for this topic in general. Firstly, using examples to support your point would be extremely useful for this debate. So this debate is a debate that will rely very heavily on examples and real life scenarios. Some useful websites to look into include like The Conversation, The Guardian, BBC News, and Wikipedia is also a really good place to start. The second thing that you might want to consider is firstly to think about what countries have not banned cyber ransoms and what countries have, and do a bit of research and think about the impact this has had on both victims and criminals in both countries. The third thing you want to think about is the extent of this issue. So for example, think about whether this issue is severe enough that we have to stop paying out criminals, or we can still pay them out, and think about who it might affect the most. The final point I want you to think about is to think about any other scenarios which we can use as an analogy. So for example, are there any other crimes which is similar to cyber ransoms where we also have a payout? And has paying criminals out in this scenario worked or not? Just a final reminder as well, there are also a lot more resources on the QDU YouTube channel, and I'd really encourage you to have a look at that if you wanted to extend your knowledge.